Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Mike Scala, and this is Nuance, joined once again by Jay Carter, aka Timid. He is the chair of BLM Tokyo. He is a hip hop artist, as well as the co-host of this here live stream. How are you, Timid?
I'm doing all right. It's a chilly morning, oddly. It's been nice and warm the past couple of weeks, and then this last night and this morning, it's been pretty cold. I'm not a fan of that.
Well, hopefully things will warm up over there in Japan. The weather's been pretty nice in New York, as our featured guest can attest to. Soledad Haren of Build a Better Planet. How are you, Soledad?
I'm doing well. Nice to meet you.
Yes, absolutely. Glad to have you on here as we get ready for another week of news and discussion and a light topic from Jay. What's our light topic this week?
News, man. I mean, movies.
Okay.
Top Gun is out in the theaters now. Now, I don't know if you're a fan of the original, or if you have been to the theater lately, but yeah, Top Gun is out, the new one, and it's killing at the box office. I think they've already done like half a billion so far. Have either of you seen it?
No.
I have.
Are you fans of the original? Are you fans of the original Top Gun?
Top Gun. That sounds familiar. I know I've heard of it before. Is that the one with Nielsen?
With who?
Tom Cruise.
Old man actor. Was it like Wesley Nielsen or something like that? What was his name?
Leslie Nielsen. No, that's Naked Gun.
Naked Gun. Okay.
Naked Gun.
No,
it was
Tom
Cruise and Val Kilmer.
Yeah, Tom Cruise. Right. So he was a Navy fighter pilot. So the elite training school for fighter pilots is called Top Gun in the Navy, and so they made a movie around that. That was it's an old movie, and they just made the sequel. And listen, I'm a fan of the original. I've seen it probably 100 times, and I actually saw the new one in the theater. I'm surprised because I live in a very small town on the coast, and Hollywood movies, foreign movies don't come here. We have one theater here. There's only 2 screens. It only shows domestic Japanese movies 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100. And it was here. And so, I knew if I went during the middle of the day, there'd be like, less than 10 people in there. So it was okay to go in there. And so, yeah, I went and seen it, and it's good. I enjoyed it. If you're a fan of the original, it's good. It's a good nostalgia play. There's a good cheesy play to it,
I think I'm more interested in the cinema in Japan than I am learning about the movie. What is that experience like, especially where you are? Because you're not in Tokyo. So you're in an area far from Tokyo. So it's kind of different. Like you said, it's mostly Japanese movies that play there. But
right.
How many American movies have they shown, and what is the method that they use to determine which American movies play? Do you know? Was it just the popular ones? Or was they think will sell well over there?
I have no idea. I've seen, I haven't paid much attention because I usually ignore the theater since, none of the Hollywood or foreign movies come to there. So I don't usually check there. But I think one of the Star Wars movies came to the theater, and then this one came to the theater. So I don't see that there being any rhyme or reason to which ones get chosen. So usually when I want to go see something like the latest Marvel movie or the latest Star Wars movie that comes out, I've got to go to a theater it's about 2 hours away at this big mall and whatnot. And I'm not doing that during the age of COVID. So, yes, I don't know why it came here. I'm glad it did, So, but if you like it, you should check it out. I know you mentioned, Soledad, you mentioned that you were tired of the lack of originality in Hollywood in regard to the films.
Probably what I'm gonna say is probably is not popular with a lot of people, but I am so sick of the comic book movies, the Marvel movies. I'm like, Batman.
I can't even get sick of them because I've probably seen maybe 1 or 2 of them. It's just not my interest.
We've lost And I grew up, and you mentioned the original Top Gun, and I'm very glad I grew up when I did, because there were lots of really good movies at that time. And I gotta admit, I did like the original Top Gun, but I was a young junior high school girl when the original came out. So I'm watching all these men shirtless playing volleyball, one of whom was Val Kilmer, the other one was Tom Cruise. I probably liked it for not the right reasons. But I'll also say, and now Mike, I heard you're a musician. I know Timid is also a musician, and I'm a bad musician, but I love the soundtrack. I mean, there was a real artistry to movies at the time, and I remember the theme to Top Gun was Berlin, Terry Nunn singing "Take My Breath Away," and of course in the music genre, there's been a terrible lack of originality there too, because Jessica Simpson, I believe, tried to remake the theme song to Top Gun, "Take My Breath Away," and I was like, oh, you are so not Terry Nunn. Please don't do that. But,
Well,
what is going on that there's just no originality? It's like the same story over and over. And, I love horror movies. That's my genre of choice. I grew up reading
that's a
Stephen
lack of
King.
originality.
But in Japan, you have some really good horror movies. I mean, and I think of some real Japanese classics, like Ringu and Audition. But then they get remade, like The Ring was Ringu, and it was remade in the US, and then they made a sequel to that, and it was nothing like the original. I'm like, no, don't do that.
Well,
way to make a lot of money because it's the franchise then, right? Then there's the merchandise, all the branding that comes with it, and people like familiar stuff.
I think you've hit the nail on the head that you have these, I mean, really and truly, you have very few media outlets. I mean, it's what I call we have the illusion of choice. Like, here in New York, we look at like pharmacies, right? And you might see a Duane Reade and a Walgreens and a Rite Aid on the corner, but really they're all the same owner. So you think you have choice, but you really don't. And that's true with even now, during COVID, we saw the explosion of all these streaming services, but they're really owned by the same owners who own, a lot of the film companies, the cable networks. So when you really look at it, you only have a handful of media companies, and they don't want to take a chance on new things. So it's, hey, let's just keep redoing Star Wars over and over again, and let's just keep redoing this over and over again. And you're like, great.
okay, now I can't let that stand. I'm sorry, I can't let that stand. There will be no Marvel movie slander in my vicinity. What they've done is incredible. It's never been done before. It's amazing. They did 24 movies, all interconnected stories over a decade worth of material.
Yeah, I'm so clueless, Jay, on all this stuff. I might have seen one Spider-Man movie. Is Spider-Man Marvel?
Spider-Man is their number one character.
Okay, so what about Batman? Was that DC?
That's DC. That's completely different. They're
I get that much. Because I was a kid, I remember Marvel versus DC. Okay, so Superman, Batman, that's DC. Then
right.
That. But someone was talking to me recently about like the MCU, is the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Right.
Like, no, this is not an MCU movie. It's just a Marvel movie. I'm like, what do you even talk? Like, what is the difference? They were trying to explain to me that like an MCU movie has all interconnected characters, and so it's not like about one superhero necessarily. It's about like all of them or a bunch of them or something. I'm still behind, and I don't think I've been aware of any of these. I don't even think I've heard of them.
Well, that's the difference. Is like, I think maybe like Venom and Morbius, those movies came out under Sony, but they're Marvel characters. But because of a contract dispute from the 90s, Sony has exclusive movie rights for the Spider-Man characters. So the MCU was are movies put out by Marvel themselves. Like, they were failing around the end of the 90s, and they were selling off their movie rights to different places to raise cash. So they did a deal for like $7 million to Sony at the time. So Sony had movie rights to Spider-Man and all of the, his people and his characters, the villains and this and that. And so they put out a couple of Spider-Man movies. That was the Tobey Maguire stuff in the early 2000s.
That one. I think 2002 maybe, right? That first
right.
one. I think I saw that one.
Right. And so they put out those, but they weren't put out by Marvel. They were put out by Sony. And so then Marvel started putting out movies and the MCU exploded. And that's when they have the whole interconnected universe of different movies.
I've never even
And
heard of
Sony-
these though. Like people say like now they're so great. How would I even hear of them? Like are these like streaming on Netflix or HBO Max, or where would they be?
They're everywhere. It's the most the most valuable franchise of all time at this point. Yeah, they're
like I don't know. Like I sometimes we hear like idle discussion, or like some friends will bring it up. I'm like, I was never aware of any of this stuff happening. I don't know.
well, yeah.
You know what we've lost though, and I think about culture and with movies and music, and some of these things are before my time, but you know, I love music from before my time as well. Like, and I think of like Bob Dylan and stuff, and singers like that who were singing about, like, really artists are the soul and consciousness of a people. They tell our history, they tell our stories. And I look at, you know, a lot of really good films and music that came out from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and they dealt with issues that were in the news at the time, you know, in movies about, how many movies were there about Vietnam, you know, and, you know, everything like movies about Vietnam that dealt with war. Then we had movies and music that dealt with the Cold War in the 80s. And because of that, I remember being a young child in the early 80s and being very much aware about, you know, tensions between Russia and the US, even as a little kid, because you saw that in the movies, you heard that reflected in the music. And, you know, and then I think of, you know, even issues like the stock market crash of 1987. I remember Wall Street, you know, that character Gordon Gekko. Look at our history since 2000. I mean, we were in Iraq and Afghanistan since 2000, 20 years of war. How many songs have we heard about either one of those wars?
Not much.
Not much. How many
I think
movies? I mean, there were a handful of movies, you know, like Jarhead that came out at the very beginning of Iraq. I think Redacted was a De Palma movie that dealt with.
I want to say it was Melly Mel. It was on Anthony Bourdain. I believe so. I believe this was Anthony Bourdain's episode when he covered the Bronx, and he started looking at the history of hip hop and talked to some hip hop pioneers. I believe he was speaking with Melly Mel, but he was talking about that same idea that
Right.
when they started, when hip hop first hit wax,
Yes.
it was like the message. It was about stuff that was going on.
Right.
And
Public
in a
Enemy.
different direction. And the songs about the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and all this stuff never
Right.
really got made. You had some stuff. I don't want to say there was nothing about that, but there probably should have been a lot more.
And, you know, I've worked with, through my nonprofit, I do work with with young people. And because of that, they don't seem to have the awareness that my generation had about stuff going on. And, you know, when I'll ask them questions, you know, what do you think about this topic and that topic? I mean, we're paying a real price for that our young people are not aware. You know, I had one group of students that weren't even aware, as students in New York, they weren't even really aware of what had happened on 9/11. And I'm like, oh my God.
You know, it's funny. I'm not funny, really sad.
It's
Someone
sad.
recently met with me, and he was young, much younger than me, and he was too young to remember 9/11. But he asked me, did it really make a difference in the way the world was? Like, he was skeptical that it really even was an important event. And I was like, it actually made a lot of difference, and it changed a lot of things. He didn't understand that because he didn't have that perspective, and he
grew up in it. So yeah, I mean, he grew up after the effects. So what's happening now is normal situations for him. I do want to say one thing though, just to, you know, so we're not bashing the young people as far as you know, being aware. We have to give them props. 2 years ago, when the George Floyd case popped off, that were young people that took to the streets in an unprecedented manner, in an unprecedented size, that for social awareness and social justice. So, you know, their music is whack, but they did hit the ground and get busy. So I got to give them props for that.
Well, I'm not criticizing them for that, because the fact is they're not being made aware of that. They don't, growing up, even on television, and I'll just give an example of, as a little girl, I would watch shows like The Golden Girls and Designing Women on TV. But, and even other shows, The Cosby Show and, shows like that were on television at the time. But those shows, even though they were comedies, they dealt with serious issues. They addressed sexism, ageism, discrimination. And they talked about AIDS. I mean, as a little kid, I became aware of AIDS and the impact that it had by watching television, because they were covering these type of topics on TV. If you watch TV now, what do they have? The housewives of wherever. I mean, keeping up with the Kardashians. They're not being educated. They're not being made aware of these issues. And that is hurting us as a society.
Well, here's a segue, because I want to get to the serious issues. So let's make people aware of some stuff, especially what you're doing. I know you're out there doing good work. Why don't we educate the people? Hopefully some youngsters are watching about some of the great work that you do.
Well, I started Build a Better Planet, and what we are is a nonprofit media company. So I always tell people I have stakeholders, not shareholders. So I don't care how much money we make off of our products, because we don't, or off of our programming, because that's not how I earn a living. And so basically we follow the PBS model. We run on donations and sponsorships, and because our main passion is sustainability and addressing issues like climate change, we try to align ourselves with B corporations, companies that are ethical and trying to do good as much as possible. And so that's what we do. We have different shows. They all tend to be in 3 parts. They focus on food. We have green guests who are doing cool things for the environment in their own communities. And then we always end every show with a musician. These are indie artists who, same thing, they're indie artists, so they don't answer to big corporations. And they also do great things for Mother Earth in their own communities.
Excellent.
Yeah, and there's
a couple of indie artists right now.
Sorry?
You're talking to a couple of indie artists right now. Maybe we might want some of your things.
And there's so much talent out there that just doesn't get heard, because it's the same thing. They want to stick, to a formula. So I said, you know what? I'll give people a platform.
And I will say I have been on a couple of your shows. Yeah. So
you were on Green Living and Green and Woke, which is our latest show.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
Excellent. And you're based right here in New York City.
I am, yes, but we have our shows are hosted by different DJs, and Green and Woke, which was the most recent show that Timid was on, is based out of Houston, Texas.
Okay.
Now you remember? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Do yours first.
I was going to say that you were talking about a trip that you took to DC recently.
That was my question too.
I'm actually going to DC. I just came back from Virginia, but I was over in the Appalachia side. But I will be going to DC, not next week, but the week after.
So talk about that. You talked about the idea of expanding the Supreme Court, right? Adding more justices. Yes,
I'm going down as part of a group called Demand Justice. And that is what we're trying to do, is expand the court. As you know, we recently had 3 justices added, and not on the most, shall we say, kosher of terms. As you recall, Mitch McConnell made it his personal mission to not seat Merrick Garland, or not even give him a hearing. I mean, he never even got that far. He never even had a hearing. And so that seat was kept open until President Obama was no longer in office. I personally think Obama should have just, done a recess appointment and got him in there anyway. But that's again our discussion that we had before the show about when they go low, we go high, or whatever. But So the end result is
And
now
they go, well, our head is in the clouds. That's how high we are.
exactly. I'm like, we got to get in there, fight dirty, man. But or you know what, fight fairly, because I feel like right now we keep bringing a knife to a gunfight and then wondering why we're not effective.
Right. It's not a fair fight. It's like
it's not a fair fight.
One team playing baseball with a designated hitter, and the other has their pitcher up to bat swinging away and missing. Yeah. They're good hitters than we do.
We're trying to play t-ball.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
But yeah, so we got right now we're dealing. What's really angered me, I'm sure we've all heard about the leak that on the Roe v. Wade
We talked
issue.
about it in great detail on this show. Yeah.
And what was the response from certain politicians? Oh, well, the leak is the biggest, that should be the biggest thing. And I'm like, or the leak is making the court look illegitimate. And I'm like, no, what made the court look illegitimate was the three stooges who got rushed onto the bench. One literally within a matter of days. And, it's incredibly, I think we're headed down something to be said when you have a court that's trying to cram through these decisions that the majority of Americans don't even agree with.
Well, I want to talk about all of this. First of all, I just want to pause to shout out some of the people tuning in. Thank you to Connie, John, James, Joe, Vinicio, Maureen, Pat, Joe, and Cindy, and everyone else checking us out. So I do want to get into more detail on this discussion. Now, obviously, there was a plan or an effort back in FDR's time to increase the justices on the court, and they called it the switch in time that saved 9, right? So we kept with the 9, and that enabled some of the New Deal legislation to get passed as a compromise. We're now looking at a situation where there are efforts, including ones made by yourself, to add more justices again, because there is no constitutional requirement that you have 9 justices. That's just done through an act of Congress. And so you could just pass a law. You can pass a bill through the House and the Senate, signed by the president, to increase the number of justices. And there are people who think that's a good idea because it will enable more justices. And so, if you have a president who gets in office, let's say, and appoints 1 or 2 or 3 justices in one way, it's not going to drastically change the dynamics of the whole court, right?
Yeah. And it's worth debating other measures that again were not mentioned in the Constitution, like should we cap their terms? I mean, you're looking at the 3 that were put on under the last president are early 50s, I believe, and early 50s. So we could be looking at having them on the bench for the next 30 years.
Generation,
yeah. That's why those appointments are so important, because of their longevity, their long terms.
Absolutely.
Right, and that's also why federal elections are so important, right?
Right.
People say, well, the president makes no difference on our everyday life, but this is a place where it does make a difference.
Absolutely. And and even in ways that
I wanted to touch on this idea that sometimes you said they make decisions that don't represent the will of the people.
Right.
I agree, but I also think there's something to be said for the idea of checks and balances. And so the Constitution is really an anti-democratic document in the sense that it's supposed to protect us. It's supposed to protect our rights and give us these certain freedoms that a corrupt majority couldn't take away, right? And so the court is supposed to come in there and say, the legislature democratically passed these measures, but we're finding them unconstitutional in spite of the fact that it was the will of the people. We're saying that the people have these rights that cannot be taken away by a democratic majority. So I think there is something to that idea, but I also hear the other side of it, which is that our whole government really is supposed to be people who represent us. And so how do we have a whole court that is in disagreement with most of the country, right?
Absolutely. On so many issues, I'm truly afraid of where we're headed as a country. And, especially when you see, certain issues like freedom of religion. And and people always remember the freedom of religion part, but they don't seem to understand that also means freedom from religion.
That's right.
And it says, right there in the First Amendment, that the government should not establish a state religion. And you wouldn't think that when you hear a lot of politicians, talking, because they constantly refer to, Judeo-Christian values, blah, blah, blah. That's not in the Constitution. And that specifically, the First Amendment says we do not establish a state religion in this country.
And
That's also why people came here in the first place from England, right? They were trying to get away from state-sponsored religion.
Free religious persecution. They were trying to get away from it, and that even plays into campaigns. Especially you see it with the presidential campaigns, where each one of them has to try to prove their more Christianness as it goes on. No, I'm really a Christian. I go to church. This is my church I go to, and it's like we shouldn't. Why?
Oh, you had a woman in Georgia campaigning on guns and babies, and I'm like, guns, babies, and Jesus. And I'm like, was Jesus pro-gun? I don't, maybe you have a different Bible than the one I've read, because I don't recall Jesus being pro-gun, but okay.
Yeah, I don't even think guns were around back then. They still had babies, but they had babies, but no guns weren't invented yet.
Right, but he would have been more the equivalent of a peace-loving hippie today, right?
Absolutely.
He'd be persecuted today. But he was persecuted in his time too. So I mean, he'd be persecuted today, but he'd also, because he was going against whatever the establishment was at the time, and it'd be the same today. I would think.
Well, let me ask you this. Yeah, that's right. If Jesus Christ ran for office today, would he be able to win a Republican nomination?
No, he would not, because he's I hate to tell people, but he's a socialist, and perhaps even further to the left, because let's see, we have somebody who openly told people to pay their taxes, right? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. He openly advocated, he healed the sick for free, so that's socialized medicine right there. I think Jesus would have been down with Bernie with the Medicare for all, He gave people loaves and fishes.
We got so in the chat, you said the right would be against him because of his brown skin.
Long hair, wore sandals, didn't own any property. And who did Jesus go after? The one group that Jesus went after, the bankers. Remember, the money traders in the temple actually went in and knocked their money changing tables over. So yeah.
Yeah, he'd have a problem there. And I think it's the same when we see people like especially on the right, when they, every year or when they go through and quote Dr. King and this and that, it's like, you would have persecuted him today. He would have been labeled terrorist, and he would have been labeled all of these different things today. Like
in his time too. I mean, people act like he was always his beloved figure. He was considered a dangerous radical in his day, and he was assassinated for it.
Absolutely.
Well, just on the topic of the environment, there's one of my favorite lines is from Freddie Mercury, and who was, by the way, not a Christian. I believe he was actually I'm going to get this wrong, Zoroaster. He was a practiced Zoroastrianism. But he wrote to the world that he created. Yeah, that how can you call yourself a Christian and then want to destroy the earth and everything in creation?
It seems like a lot of these
doesn't. I don't quite understand that.
Yeah, I don't want to get too judgmental myself, but it seems like a lot of these so-called Christian values you see are really more Old Testament values than New Testament, which is kind of ironic, right? I mean, it's almost like not Christian. That's the Jewish Bible. It's not the Christian Bible.
Right. The eye for an eye. Well, that's in the Old Testament. What does the New Testament say? If you actually look at the words of Christ, turn the other cheek. Blessed are the peacemakers. That doesn't. That's completely opposite to what you hear. But and so now with the issue of expanding the court, and we have this Roe v. Wade, ruling that's probably going to definitely will be an overturn this summer. So when people talk about, religious values, whose religion are you actually talking about? Because the Jewish faith, well, in Islam actually does allow for abortion. There's actually a cutoff period. I'm not Muslim, so I'm not gonna profess to be an expert on the Quran, but I know abortion is allowed in Islam up to a certain time period. In the Jewish faith, not only is abortion allowed, but preference is given to the life of a mother. So in the case of, for instance, an ectopic pregnancy, where the mother could die if the pregnancy is allowed to continue. And let's be real here. In the case of an ectopic pregnancy, you're going to lose the baby anyway. But if you don't terminate the pregnancy, the mother could die. So in the Jewish faith, you have to say the life of the mother takes priority. You have to save them on. So when we talk about these religious values, whose religion? Like, or, and even.
But why should we be using religion? The First Amendment expressly prohibits that. So we're talking about what the government is doing. We should not have religion in a mix. And that's not an anti-religious approach. That's just a pro-constitutional approach, right? That's what America is supposed to be. Religion is supposed to be private. That's not how we're supposed to make our decisions politically through the courts.
Right, absolutely. And I think what's boiling down to, it's not so much the religion, it's more of a group thing, right? Because even when, if you remember when the previous White House occupant was there, and the Pope said some things that he didn't like, and that so-called religious right turned on the Pope. So it's not a religious thing. It's what it's put out there to be like, okay, it's against our religion. It's just your group thing,
That's a good point, because then you have different denominations. So a lot of Protestants not going to like the Catholic Pope, and you have Muslims, you have Christians, Jews, all different types of religions. And so you can't even say religious values as if it's one thing. I mean, everyone has their own idea as to what that should be. And so it's more just your particular group.
Yeah. And that's what it is.
Interestingly enough, the religious right, the evangelicals movement in the U.S. didn't even address abortion until the 1970s, and that's because there was a man named Francis Schaeffer, and ironically, his son, who was also part of the evangelical movement, his son has since left the evangelical movement. And that he was the one who went to Jerry Falwell, and convinced him to pick up the mantle of being anti-abortion as a way of gaining support in the South for the Republican Party. So in actuality, it had nothing.
Also, I know, Jay, you don't really like when people make or try to tie this issue to racial justice, but wasn't that part of the strategy politically, that it was taboo to talk about race and to be overtly racist, but we still need to scare people into coming into our fold. So we need an issue that will motivate them, and this is the one we're doing.
Right. From what I read was, I read something in that regard where that point they were losing that racial battle, and they were like, basically, we need another boogeyman, so to speak, or we need another point, because we were getting the Civil Rights Act was coming through, that racism was becoming something more recognized as negative. So so they was talking about, they looked on for a new topic, a new banner to pick up, and abortion was one of them.
Right. And then after that, of course, was homosexuality, and that was the other how we ended up with people.
Go back to this idea of expanding the court beyond 9 justices. I mean, obviously this could be done by Democrats, let's say, but then that number would be fixed until it was changed again, or if, unless it was changed again, that would be then utilized by Republicans in the future as well. I mean, is there a drawback to this? Could this backfire, or do you think it's just the fair thing to do? I mean, is it the best approach? Are there any negatives to it? What do you think?
Well, you're right. I mean, because the one drawback would be, okay, let's say we expand to 13 and then, we have a changeover in leadership, and then the next person will say, okay, well, let's just add some more. Could we do something, and this is just my suggestion, I'm not I'm not speaking for anybody, but what if we did something, and I'm bad at math here, sorry, but if we said, okay, we're going to expand the court and have so many on the liberal side, so many on the conservative side, and then people have so many that are more in the middle, and that way you would actually get a more accurate representation of the United States population.
I don't like that because they're supposed to be judges. They're supposed to be impartial. They're not supposed to be
They are.
so conservative, or they're supposed to look at it from a law point of view. They're supposed to look at it from that impartial point of view. And I think that's probably the problem that we're having right now in our national discourse. Is you see people on the right screaming, oh, there's not enough conservative representation in the media. Well, they're not supposed to be. There's supposed to be a non-biased
Right.
representation in the media. It's not supposed to be the conservative view and the
their argument though is that it is biased, right? They're saying that they would like it to be unbiased, but they say that it's too liberal.
Right. And that's, to me, that's reserved for your opinion pieces. That's reserved for your independent blogs, right? And whatnot. That shouldn't be for your standard news. That shouldn't be for your court systems. If you want to have those, you got your independent shows or whatever to do that, but for the standard news, for the stuff that's informing people that we rely on for the facts and for information.
Right, but also that's not the government, so that's not really something that should be mandated or regulated in that way. I mean, people will say like, oh, I don't want athletes or I don't want entertainers talking about politics. They've got the right to talk about whatever they want to talk about, and they can't say athletes are too liberal. I mean, no, the people can be what they want to be. I mean, get some more conservative athletes now, but that's nothing that we should be regulating. We're trying to control.
Right.
Well, the problem with the court, and I agree with you 100%, Tim, that in theory, yeah, a judge is supposed to be impartial. You're a judge, but then look what we saw with the 3 recent appointees, that you had 3 people. I mean, and personally, to me, they committed perjury. The 3 of them went in front of Congress and said, oh, well, we recognize that Roe is precedent, stare decisis, Roe is precedent, and now look what's happened.
But yeah, and that's what I think is it shows it calls into question their ability to do the job. And not necessarily even because they lied there, but because even the rationale they used to push it past, it showed that there was a bias that they went into with and they had an outcome they already had in mind. And that's against what they're supposed to be there to do. I think, I don't know if there is a process, Mike, I'm sure you can speak to that. If there's a process to remove a judge for failing to do their duty the way it's supposed to be done.
Right, and that's almost unprecedented in US history at that level. In fact, it is unprecedented at that level, but even talking about removing a federal judge, that has almost never happened. But when I was in law school, I remember reading Supreme Court cases and getting very cynical because we're taught about the law. We're not taught about political leanings of justices. We're just taught about the Constitution, and then we're reading cases and we're seeing how they're interpreting them. But it got to a point where you could predict how the justices were going to rule based on their politics or based on the president that appointed them. And it seemed that they were just then trying to come up with a rationale that would support the conclusion that they already wanted to reach. And it was almost comical, like every single time it would be like that. But I do have to be fair and say that even the recent appointees weren't 100% on Trump's side. I mean, Trump appointed them, and some of the first decisions they made went against his administration's policies. So even they are able to interpret the law fairly at times, it seems.
Right.
And then you look at Thomas. I mean, we talk about somebody who's got an agenda and somebody who should probably be removed, or at the very least, someone who should have recused himself.
Especially when your wife's political activity, right?
When your wife is so openly supporting an insurrection, I mean, quite disturbing.
Right. But see, the thing is this, though, going back to the earlier idea of having a set number of liberals and a set number of conservatives, you would basically be making someone like Joe Manchin or his equivalent on Supreme Court the most powerful person in America, right? Because you would basically the liberals and the conservatives would cancel each other out on the major ones, and whoever the one or two or three swing justices would determine everything.
Right.
So we'd be creating Iowa in the Supreme Court.
Oh goodness. But
Yeah.
yeah, but right now we have a real impending nightmare. You know, I'm not, I gotta say, I'm not very hopeful. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, people tend to look at things as like, well, that doesn't affect me, you know, Roe v. Wade, I'm not a girl. Although I did put a post on Twitter. I said, gentlemen, if you think this does not affect you, think about this. You could end up paying child support for 18 years. So, you know, yeah, it very much could affect you, but it's also, this is one decision that could then very easily lead to other decisions that affect other people. Gay marriage, and you know, if we're going to outlaw
marriage, contraception, all of these
contraception, exactly. This is a very slippery slope,
right? And
you know, do we want to become Gilead? That's what I'm afraid of.
Well, one way that people can make a difference is at the state level, because the Roe draft, as we understand it to be, would kick the right to abortion, lack thereof, to the individual states. And so the state legislature elections are going to be crucial if you want to have a say as to what your state does on that issue and other important issues, which are now being left to the states. And so I did want to talk a little bit about some of what New York has done, because we're at the end of the legislative session for New York. They go from January till June, and June is kind of that last minute scramble where you try to get everything through that you couldn't get through 5 months prior. So we do have some bills that passed last minute, and I wanted to highlight a few of them. One of them, I guess I'll start with this one because I got the chance to work on it when I was in Albany. I served as counsel and legislative director in the state Senate, and this was under State Senator James Sanders Jr. There was a series of bills actually, and I wasn't the only one to work on it. There were others even who came before me on this, and there were advocates for sickle cell disease, and people who suffer from sickle cell really want to see more funding and more study and just more support around the issue. And so there's a package of bills I worked on. One of them had passed previously, but we found out that a second one passed both houses of the state of New York recently, and that would provide more study for sickle cell. There is a third one that we're still trying to get through that will provide funding for this, because we want to create more centers around the state that are solely dedicated to sickle cell. It's a very serious disease that doesn't get enough attention, and it disproportionately affects African Americans. So that's good news that passed. We're waiting.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, it affects, what is it, like you said, it's disproportionately. It's like, isn't it like?
I believe the numbers that we had were about 1 in 12.
We're African American or something like that. Yeah, it's a pretty high rate. 13 Black or African American babies are born with sickle cell trait, and 1 in 365 were born with the disease. That's higher than I expected.
Yeah.
Wow.
So again, we need more study, treatment, and funding devoted to this. But something else that passed both houses, and we're waiting for a signature from the governor, is a ban on selling dogs, cats, and rabbits in retail stores. And a lot of animal rights advocates have been calling for this. They're really trying to crack down on the so-called puppy mills. And I think this is a way to do that. Of course, now everyone encourages you to adopt a rescue animal, and people also are able to buy from private breeders. A lot of this happens online, but this bill signed by the governor would shut down all of the stores or make it illegal for the stores to sell these animals. What do we think about that?
I think it's interesting. You know, the puppy mills have been an issue for a long time as far as the treatment of the animals and how they're dealt with. And you know, out here, I don't think it's really a big issue out here. And maybe it's, you know, and I'm sure the same type of practices are happening that was happening in the States that you know, had people calling for the end of these puppy mills. But I was actually just walking through the mall the other day, and there's like a big pet store in there, and there's all these puppies, and you mentioned rabbits. There's a rabbit near the side. It's bigger than your dog, Mike. And you know, I don't see those calls for those things out here. But I think it's, you know, it could be a good thing if they can clean up how these animals are being treated.
I agree. Yeah, and I always have this, I guess, visceral reaction where it's like, well, people should be able to do what they want to do, freedom of contract, blah, blah, blah. But you do need to have regulation in certain areas, right? And this could be one of those areas.
Yeah, and there's just, I tend to agree that there are horror stories that you hear from the puppy mills, and now private breeders, I mean, there are some who are, I don't know that much about private breeding. I know some that, you know, that do stick to kennel club, you know, regulations and so forth, because the fear there is you could have private breeders who are essentially acting as puppy mills also. I know larger pet stores, like the large chain pet stores, didn't sell dogs anyway. They tended to sell more little tiny, you know, gerbils or whatever. But I had seen in Manhattan, for instance, there are a couple of little tiny pet stores that did have all little puppies in the window, which I'm certain came from puppy mills. And, you know, the other thing is hopefully this will encourage people to adopt, because, you know, you always, especially during COVID, this angered me quite a bit that, you know, people, they had record numbers of people going out and buying dogs. I get it. You're home alone. You want a pet. But then they had record number of people returning the dogs afterwards. And you see this a lot around the holidays, around Christmas or whatnot, or when certain movies come out. Like I remember when 101 Dalmatians came out, everybody wanted a Dalmatian. And not really, you know, you're adopting a dog that you're going to need to take care of. And I know in New York City, there's a big problem in that a lot of dogs you tend to find in rescues are like pit bulls, these larger dogs, because people see them in videos or whatever, and oh, that's cool. It's kind of seen as a status symbol. And I'm like, have you really thought this through? A pit bull is an animal that is all muscle. It eats quite a bit. You need it needs to run around. It's very difficult to keep an animal like that in a tiny New York City apartment. I mean, my apartment's quite small. And, you know, did you really think about, you know, do you have small children in the home? You know, I'm not picking on pit bulls or anything, by the way, but there are certain breeds that do better outside running around in the country. There are certain breeds that do better with little children, particularly if you have other children coming to your home, you know, that could be a potential liability. I travel a lot for my work, so my dog that I had was a little purse-sized Chihuahua, and he went with me everywhere.
Oh, those should be banned.
Yeah, my little Chihuahua.
Again, Jay, you said they're big in Japan?
No, I said Chihuahuas should be banned.
No.
My dog is half Chihuahua.
They're always loud and noisy, and they're mean. Like, talk about mean dogs. Get rid of the Chihuahuas. No. Be banned. You know?
My dog is a perfect
example of their owners.
Half Chihuahua, half Jack Russell, and he's an awesome dog.
Oh, it's just noisy.
It's noisy. You know what, though? What's funny about this whole discussion is that you would think that a shop, an actual store where they do this for a living, would be more responsible and would know more than people selling animals privately. I mean, obviously certain breeders are going to know what they're doing if they're legitimate breeders, but if you have someone who's not, who just does it as a hobby or just decides to sell a dog, it's just funny that we're kind of giving them more legitimacy now than actual stores, which in theory should be devoted to doing this the right way.
Well, that was what I was going to say. I think in this ban on it, again, it shifts it to where it's going to be, you know, adoption or, you know, breeders. But the breeders themselves could be doing a puppy mill like conditions. And you would think that another way to fix it or to help the situation would just be to add certain regulations for you know, these so-called puppy mills or whatever you want to call the companies that would breed these to sell to pet stores, that, you know, there has to be this much space for the dog, that the dog has to, the animals have to maintain this certain health standard. And this and that way you would have a regulation standard that they'd have to follow, which could be more beneficial. So I mean, I think that's another way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't you just, in theory, now have stores who are going to be operating the same exact way, but just no longer with a storefront. Does that make it better?
Well, I think the thing with the puppy mills is that I guess these companies, when they're trying to get these puppies or these cats or whatever, the animals end up being malnourished. They try to overbreed them, like I guess they force them to try to breed to make as many as possible. The sanitation is not as good. But I mean, I would think just regulate those companies.
But that's my point, right? I mean, all of those issues that you mentioned could also be done by private breeders, right? The
Absolutely.
Itself.
Absolutely. And with no oversight, yeah, it can absolutely happen. If you put the oversight, then I don't think the pet stores need to stop selling it if there's oversight on, how those conditions are carried out.
Because if I'm a government agency trying to regulate this, it's easier for me to walk into a store and take a look around what's going on than try to get into someone's house or garage, right?
Absolutely. So
Now,
that's why the show is called Nuance. We try to examine things from both sides and play devil's advocate a little bit.
Yeah.
Kudos to New York on a couple things with pets. New York, I know New York was one of the has created a pet. Trying to see how I can word this. It's like animal abuse registry. Like you have the sex offender registry. There's an animal abuser registry in New York, which I am glad for that. But also, like with the breeding, for instance, I think of the dog fighting rings, which are beyond horrific. I know there are some in New York City. Certainly there are some in other states as well. But the problem with a lot of these things is there just are not the resources to prosecute and to investigate. So unfortunately, they tend to not be taken seriously. I believe, I think under recent law, it's now a felony to commit an act of animal abuse in New York. I believe, don't quote me, Mike, you might know better about that. But, in many other states, it's a misdemeanor. So, unfortunately, that is a real problem, but they just don't have the resources to investigate. They don't have the, and again, then what gets prioritized, unfortunately.
Well, my campaign manager bought a dog from one of these stores in Queens, and the dog turned out to be very sick. Now, there was something in the contract that mandated that the store take care of the vet bills for a certain period, and he certainly utilized that. But nonetheless, he got a sick dog that almost died on his watch. I mean, how horrible is that? You fall in love with this puppy at the store, you take him home and he almost dies on you. And for months now, you take him back and forth to the vet, trying to get the dog to recover. And it's, and then you think about all the other dogs that might be going through this. I mean, are they just selling a bunch of sick dogs? And in fact, I went on review, I don't know if it was Google reviews or Yelp or one of these sites, and I looked up some of the reviews from this particular store, and there were a lot of people complaining that they got sick puppies from the store. So that kind of thing really makes you stop and think, like, we need to do something to stop this abuse.
Right. Where are they getting them from? But obviously they're getting them from somebody who's not treating them right. Well,
it seems like they're not treating them right at the store.
Yeah. A lot of neglect and it's difficult. I mean, I wish there were more resources, to investigate things like this. And I think they're just really underfunded.
Right. Well, I guess we should put the poll question out to the people on this topic for the week. And the question we wanted to ask this week is, do you agree that there should be a ban on selling dogs, cats, and rabbits in retail stores?
I wonder where the rabbits came in from. I never hear them in that conversation. Puppy mill. So you talk about puppies, and of course you would include cats, but I wonder how rabbits snuck in there. They just hopped right on into the conversation.
It's from that famous saying that everyone says all the time. It's raining cats, dogs, and bunnies.
I'm wondering if they're being sold as pets. I mean, I just had a horrible thought, but are they being sold
Like
maybe
snake
not
food or something?
as food? Yeah.
I don't think so. I think they're pets.
Not in pet stores. Not in pet stores. I don't think anyone's going in there to
this
look for
context,
their next.
they're for pets. I think it's because of the point that you made earlier about some of the stores that they'll still sell gerbils and hamsters and things like that, or birds. But that's kind of put in a different category as bigger pets. I guess they're putting rabbits more with the dogs and the cats in this context.
Right. Yeah. I thought, yeah, I don't think anyone's going into PetSmart to look for their next Hassenpfeffer ingredients.
Well, they
Right.
do. They do sell rodents to feed the snakes at PetSmart, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that sucks. I mean, like, they can
That's
be.
what they eat. I mean, it's my understanding that snakes prefer live prey. You know?
No, they want to hunt.
Yeah, well, I would imagine dogs and cats do too. Like,
That's why you
again?
know, a dog toy, and the dog runs after it and tries and bites it and starts shaking it. It's like, it's his nature. He's like hunting a prey.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Pedigree again. Oh my God. It's just garbage.
Well, thank you.
If I did it, my
Thank you to everyone tuning
little
in.
children.
Pete, Paul, Dennis, and everyone on the chat, and everyone catching us after the fact on YouTube and on Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are available. We appreciate you. In the few minutes we have remaining, we do want to go over our poll results from last week. And let's pull it up here. And I actually have a couple of things I wanted to add on that topic as well. So while we're speaking on it.
And just to remind what the poll was that does media and journalists, should they be held accountable for reporting false information? So what were your results?
Oh.
My results were 100% yes. The caveat that it wasn't one of the polls that a lot of people were weighing in on. Some of my polls will go back and forth all day long, and it's a big thing. This one people seem to shy away from a little bit. I have my ideas as to why that might be, but the people who did vote said yes.
Yeah. In my results, it was overwhelmingly yes, but I did have one no vote, and they engaged me in the chat on that. And I think the where they were coming from, and it does, make sense. It might be what you're thinking about, Mike, is that who decides what is the truth? And so we have that skepticism now, especially, that's just what their truth. That doesn't mean this is what the real truth is. And so,
like who decides if up down or down is up, right? Like, it's like,
right.
And with her alternative fact, right?
Yeah, alternative facts.
Kellyanne with her alternative facts. I don't know who came up with that ridiculous saying, "Oh, that's my truth." No, there's not my truth. There's only there's a truth and there's a lie.
Well, I think
especially if you're talking about journalism, because journalism is supposed to be investigative reporting. You're supposed to be looking up facts. And sadly, there's not that much investigative reporting going on anymore. And but yeah, if you're just doing an opinion piece, then that's not journalism. It's like a talk magazine kind of thing. But I don't know if we have that many of those anymore. Like The View or something, where you're just the show The View, where people are just giving their opinion. But if you're doing a hardcore journalism piece, that's facts. You're supposed to go do research, So this idea of, oh, that's my truth, who determines the truth? There's a thing called facts,
Well, I think that's definitely true. I think it's what I would say in that regard is journalists knowingly reporting falsehoods. So
right.
If they have a story and they know that the point that's in the story doesn't go with the opinion or the viewpoint of the station or the network or whatever, and they exclude it, they're knowingly reporting a falsehood. I think that's something that needs to be corrected and
that's part of the legal standard too, especially when you're speaking of public figures. I should say, when you're speaking of public figures, it's knowing or consciously disregarding a substantial risk, which is just fancy words for saying you knew that it was false, or you realized that it could have been false, or there's a good chance of it being false, and you went your own way anyway, right?
Right. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed, and that is in the poll. Now, the alternative
that's why I had it in mind in the text, because I know the way I worded it vocally was false information, but on my poll, I wrote blatantly false.
Right. Yeah.
Intentionally, right? Because like newspapers often might make a mistake and then they'll turn around and print a retraction. We meant to write this.
Sure.
But what I'm thinking of in terms of falsehoods is the current legal case against Newsmax with Dominion, when they're people making claims that the ghost of Cesar Chavez was rigging election machines, and they got sued for defamation because that's a lie.
This is how this came up, and I don't want to go too much into the details, but I filed a $10 million lawsuit on behalf of a client against the Daily News for defamation. And this was a situation like that where there was blatantly false information being reported. And the reporter knew and was given ample evidence to show that what he was saying wasn't true, but he wanted to push his narrative and went ahead and reported the fake
right.
stuff anyway.
Right.
So that's a real problem. I wanted to talk about this, and I want to pick on this guy again. I brought him up last week. I was speaking on it in terms of the facts that were reported, or something called a mixed opinion, where you say something that's kind of an opinion on its face, but it implies certain facts, and those facts might not be true. So I use that as an example. But there was this piece that was about me. It was a blog article, I guess, about me, something called the new narrative. It really should be called the false narrative, because a lot of what it was saying was just blatantly untrue. But part of it that I wanted to touch upon this week, and Jay, this might speak to you as well. Someone was quoted in that piece talking about me, saying that I was a coward for quote unquote, and I'm not quoting him here, but so I shouldn't say quote unquote, I guess I want to be precise, but for basically saying that I catered to the police. But the reason why he said this was because I didn't want to abolish the police, and I said defund was a bad message. And so is that catering to the police, and is that cowardice, or is that nuance? Is that saying I'm not, because to me, I would argue the cowardly take is to just blindly do the retweets and blindly say, parrot what everyone else is saying. I think it takes bravery to say, hold on a second. I agree with reforms, but I want to have a more nuanced conversation here. I don't think this is the right messaging. I think this is the right messaging. You know what I mean? That to me is the brave thing to do, not the cowardly thing to do. I think they're being cowardly by refusing to allow for any nuance and only allow the retweets and the hashtags.
Right.
The issue through.
We've had this discussion before, like on that slogan of defund the police, whereas it's just a bad slogan because it doesn't communicate. It doesn't communicate what it is that they actually want to do and what they want to get across. And what they want to get across, if they speak what they're saying, there's a lot that makes sense there. As far as reduce some of the funding. Make it so the police aren't dealing with mental health cases. Get the militarization out of the local police force. Like all that makes sense, but defund the police doesn't communicate that message. So, I'm with you on that part. And there should be a nuanced discussion. However, I do get the other point where this idea of reform and having more discussions is at this point really frustrating and sometimes counterproductive, because it just doesn't change anything. And you can't really completely fix something that's so corrupt. And from communities that are victims of this violence from the police repeatedly and have been for decades, talking about let's have another conversation seems like non-action.
Like everyone is having a conversation. It's just, what is the conversation you're having? I mean, what they're doing is they're having conversations amongst themselves on Twitter, which aren't really conversations. They're just retweets and hashtags. That's not policy. We talked about that before. Right. So there is a conversation to be had, because in order to get things done, you have to talk about what you're doing. You have to sit at a table and negotiate a bill or a policy change or whatever it's going to be. There needs to be a conversation, but it should be a smart conversation. And to be able to have nuance and say, let's go down the line and talk about the policy items we're trying to achieve. To me, that's not cowardly. That's the way to get something done. To say that's catering to the police? No, that's having a conversation about policy that we're trying to change. And by the way, I've worked in Albany, and I've actually worked on and passed actual police reform, not just on Twitter, not just to me. How are you going to call me a coward for actually achieving police reform?
Right, absolutely. And the results of those conversations needs to be action. Right. And so the hashtag and the tweet raises more awareness, but doesn't necessarily translate into action. So you have to, there has to be something that takes
No,
place.
and by the way, I'm being a little facetious. I'm not saying we shouldn't hashtag and tweet. Right? What I'm saying is if that's all they're doing, I'm basically maybe comically, but I'm reducing their side to that to mock them because they're trying to mock me. They're trying to say that I'm some coward for having a nuanced conversation. I'm saying, well, all y'all doing is tweeting these ridiculous messages, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we have to, I agree with both of you. I thought it was a terrible slogan, and we lost seats in Congress because of that. I think of Max Rose, who
Speak your truth.
Max,
It's
Max
actually the
Rose
truth. Is it right? It's the truth. It's objective.
The Democrat from Staten Island, for one of the first Democrats from Staten Island in a long time.
Max Rose.
Max Rose, right. But who lives in Staten Island? There are lots of cops that live in Staten Island. They didn't like hearing that message. Now look who got
City Council. More Republicans got in than we've had. I mean, yes, this has caused us a lot of damage. And
we're going to pay for that.
Look at what I'm saying, who in good faith, and because this all came about because we're talking about journalism and being fair and reporting facts. Who in good faith is going to look at what I'm talking about and what all of us are talking about and say that that's cowardly, or that we don't represent a positive change? Like, no, look at our policy, look at our proposals, look what we advocate for. I mean, you're going to DC to advocate for the Supreme Court stuff. Like, we're all about it. Timid is the chair of BLM Tokyo. I mean, you know what I mean? So to try to write this article, I cater to the police. Why? Because I want to have a real conversation that's not childish.
And I think part of the problem is when something happens, there's always a knee-jerk reaction. I think of The Simpsons, when there was an episode of The Simpsons years ago where there was a bear in town, and so everybody in town decides to create this bear patrol or something. Like, we tend to overreact. How about we stop and really think about stuff? I think part of it was maybe instead of defund the police, maybe they should have come up with a slogan like reform the police.
Reform.
And one thing they don't think about, just because this issue is very near and dear to me, I've volunteered in the past at sheltered for battered women. I've had friends in the past who've worked for battered women organizations. A lot of the phone calls to the police are for domestic violence. And so when you're saying defund the police, what you're actually saying is get rid of the police department, is what you're actually saying.
That's how a lot of people hear that, right?
And if you're that battered wife, or you need help at that moment. And I've even had this discussion. I had a friend of mine who said that in her building she kept hearing somebody who was being abused, a neighbor. She was hearing the sounds, and then she did a poll on Facebook of her friends. Hey, should I call the police or not? And people were saying things like, oh, well, just write a note. I'm like, I don't know if you've ever been in that situation. But yeah, at that moment, writing a note isn't going to help. Okay. At that moment where somebody is in a life or death situation, you need to call the police. You need to dial 911. Sorry. And right. I just think people are not being very realistic.
Most of us agree that there should be other options. If you call 911, maybe you don't want the police, depending on what the situation is. Maybe you do want a mental health professional, but you should also have the option to get the police if that's what you need at that time.
Yeah, because especially you don't know in especially domestic violence cases tend to be some of the most violent cases. You don't know what's on the other side of that door. You don't know if the victim is being held at gunpoint, and then do you really want to just send in an unarmed therapist? You don't know what you're facing. And but I think that a lot of people with good intentions jumped on the defund the police bandwagon didn't think about. They're not thinking about every case, if there's a bank robbery, are you going to send a therapist to that? No.
Right. And, I also wanted to point out that there's this, again, a false narrative out there in my part of Queens, but it's not just my part of Queens. It happens throughout the city and probably throughout the country where, yes, there's a lot of segregation in our neighborhoods, but they try to reduce it to, in the south of the district, they're all conservative white people, and in the north, they're all progressive people of color. It's not that clean. In fact, when I go to neighborhoods of color in my district, you know what they tell me the top issue is? public safety. They're not trying to abolish the police or talk about defunding the police. Reforms, yes, no one wants to be abused, and you know what I mean? The common sense reforms, absolutely. But public safety is a concern people have, and you can't try to, and you know, people, they're trying to be anti-racist by saying, you know, we want to abolish the police from their safe white neighborhoods, I think, a lot of the times. But when you actually go into neighborhoods most affected by crime, that's not what people are talking about.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, listen, the real truth is as a society, we need police. I mean, that's unquestionable.
Yeah.
And, you know, but there does need to be higher responsibility and higher accountability for the police, right? We can't have bad actors. This is not a Burger King job where you get the order wrong, you just come back to the counter and get another burger, right? A police officer abuses someone, violates their civil rights, that is not just an oops, all right? That needs to be dealt with. That is something that can't happen because they have the trust of the public. They have the responsibility to keep the public safe and uphold public safety. So I think we have to look at it in that point of view, and the police need to be reformed from that standard. Defunding, yeah, not defund as in abolish, reform, reduce funding. Some of it, they're getting more money than they need to. They don't need military weapons. They don't need tanks and all of this stuff, you know? That's what people have to get into.
And reallocate, you know, you could put some of that money.
Well, they agree in reform. They agree that the blue wall of silence needs to be dismantled, right? Like all that stuff. This is what the police themselves will tell you if you actually speak to them as well.
I don't buy that.
I have conversations. I'm talking about private conversations.
I will call those
public. I'm not talking about what they say in the media, with what the unions putting out. I'm talking about private conversations with police officers who want their jobs to be easier and safer too. Right.
Now that I agree with on the private, but in there, the problem is that they're not able up front to cross that blue line of silence. If they don't do it, then they're part of the problem as well. Right.
And that's a big problem. It's built into the system.
Right. Yeah.
And you can put money into things like recruiting, you know, a more diverse police corps, a more diverse body.
Yes, and this is the stuff that we're at. And again, it goes back to you're saying I'm a coward. Look at my work. Part of my work has been pushing to allow people to serve their own communities on the police force, even geographically. That's something that I've worked on. And that has to be done at the policy level because the NYPD doesn't allow that as a policy right now. But I've been in the rooms, you know, pushing for this change, as have a lot of others with me. So these are real things that we're talking about, real solutions that we're pushing for.
Right.
And it helps, you know, if you have, I think it helps build trust in the community. If you have police in a certain neighborhood where there might be, you know, people who speak mostly a certain language, and you have cops who speak that language, be it, you know, here in New York, cops who speak Russian, cops who speak Chinese, you know, Mandarin or Cantonese, whatever. The people, I think if people are more likely to trust going to an officer who looks like them, who speaks their language, you know.
Right. Especially in an immigrant community where a lot of people are afraid to call the police.
Yes.
Maybe someone in their home is undocumented, or, you know, who knows what the deal is, but they have this distrust. And if you have someone who they can relate to, who can speak their language, they'll be much more likely to want to work with them and feel comfortable.
Or they're coming countries where people don't trust the police, because I've seen that in immigrant communities as well.
I think it's also important that the police understand the culture and the communities and the conditions of the people where they serve, because that's gonna bear out a certain type of you know, action, personality, air, environment, all of that. And if you don't understand that, then you're going to look at it from a different perspective of the people that you're trying to you know, protect and serve, you know. So.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, we've done it again. We keep saying we're going to stick to the hour, and we always go over, but that's okay, because these are great discussions that we have, and I think they warrant the overtime.
Yes, definitely. So appreciate Soledad for joining us this week, and check us out on YouTube and also on wherever podcasts are at as well.
Like, subscribe, hit the bell, do all those YouTube-y things.
Yeah. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Till next week.
Thank you.